The world did not begin with silence. It began with breath, the slow, deep exhalation of a planet still figuring out what it wanted to be. Before the continents knew their names, before the first flower opened its face to a sun that had never once been looked at, the earth was alive in a way it would never be again, alive with a fullness that pressed against every horizon and dripped from every leaf and thundered in every throat of every creature that had ever earned the right to call this green and steaming world its home. The mist came first, always the mist, pouring in long silver scarves between the trunks of trees so ancient they had no names in any language that would ever exist. It moved through the primeval forest clearing like something that had somewhere to be, curling around roots as thick as castle walls, climbing into the low branches of conifers whose crowns scraped the belly of a sky the color of hammered pewter. The ferns on the forest floor were wet. They were always wet. Everything here was always wet. The bark, the moss, the stone, the very air, and the moisture gave the world a luminous quality, as though the forest itself were lit from within, as though the green light filtering down through the canopy were not light at all but something older and stranger, something that had been here since before light knew what to do with itself. And then the roar came. It did not start as sound. It started as pressure, a vibration in the chest, a tightening in the sternum, something primal that preceded hearing, that spoke directly to whatever ancient part of the nervous system still remembered what it was to be small and soft and surrounded by things that were neither. The pressure built, expanded, and then it erupted into the world as pure, unfiltered sound. A sound so vast and so absolute that the ferns trembled and the mist scattered and every bird that had ever perched in the high branches of the conifers launched itself skyward in a panic of wings and cries. The clearing was no longer empty. It had never really been empty. It had only been waiting. The Tyrannosaurus Rex stood at the center of the world. Its mouth was open so wide it seemed to divide the creature into something above and something below, the upper jaw lifting toward the pale sky while the lower jaw dropped toward the dark earth, and between them was a darkness so complete, so absolute, that it seemed less like the interior of an animal and more like a door into some other place entirely. The teeth caught the rim light, that thin, cold band of illumination that pressed in from behind, outlining every scale and ridge and curve of the creature's enormous body in silver, and each tooth became a separate spectacle, serrated and yellowed and enormous, each one longer than a man's forearm, each one shaped by millions of years of intention. The tongue was pink and massive and glistening. The throat was a cavern. The roar itself was a weather event. From below, from the perspective of the forest floor where the ferns shook and the mud still held the impression of something that had passed through only moments before, the creature was incomprehensible in its scale. The legs alone were columns, pillars of muscle and bone sheathed in skin so textured, so alive with subtle iridescence where the light caught the microscopic structures of the scales, that it seemed wrong to call it merely skin at all. It was armor and record and biography all at once. Scarred in places where something had tried and failed, darkened in others where age had deepened the pigmentation, and everywhere along the flanks and the neck there ran that impossible shimmer, that ghost of color, green and then blue and then something with no name at all, visible only when the volumetric fog shifted and the light moved and the creature moved with it. The fog drifted between the towering ancient conifers in long, slow currents, unhurried, indifferent to the drama at its center, and the deep green and gray-blue atmosphere of the clearing absorbed and softened and made ancient everything it touched. The roar faded. The mist returned. The Tyrannosaurus Rex closed its mouth and stood in the clearing and breathed, and the whole forest breathed with it, and for a moment that lasted as long as the world wanted it to, there was nothing else. But the world did not stay still. It never stayed still. Life in the ancient Cretaceous was a state of constant, frantic, gorgeous motion, and even as the great predator stood in its clearing with the mist curling around its feet, elsewhere in the same forest, beneath the same canopy, two other shapes were moving through the undergrowth with a precision and a patience that was, in its own way, just as terrifying as anything that announced itself with a roar. They moved as one creature. That was the first thing you noticed about the velociraptors. Not the talons, not the teeth, not the eyes, though the eyes were extraordinary, yellow and sharp and full of a cold intelligence that had no business existing in the Cretaceous, and yet here it was, fully formed, fully operational, watching everything and missing nothing. No, the first thing you noticed was the synchronicity. The way the two of them moved through the dense undergrowth in perfect parallel, their bodies low to the ground, their weight distributed with such precision across those powerful hind legs that they made almost no sound at all, was not the synchronicity of animals following instinct. It was the synchronicity of partnership, of two minds that had learned to function as one. Their side-by-side low crouching posture compressed them into the geometry of the jungle itself. They were the shadow between two ferns, the darkness below the rotting log, the stillness that existed between one moment and the next. The light came down through the fern canopy in fragments, broken into coins and splinters by the layered fronds above, and it lay across the ground in a pattern that shifted with the breeze, and the raptors moved through that shifting pattern with their cool teal and dark gray skin tones absorbing and deflecting the light in equal measure. The shallow depth of field of the jungle worked in their favor. The world behind them blurred into abstraction, deep greens and near blacks dissolving into each other, and they remained in focus as they moved forward, precise and inevitable. The tension in the scene was not in motion. It was in the pause between motions, that suspended moment when both animals froze simultaneously, heads tilted at the same angle, listening to something that had not yet made a sound. Whatever they had heard, they gave nothing away. They simply waited, and the jungle waited with them. The scale of the ancient world announced itself again and again in ways that the mind struggled to process, and nowhere more completely than in the presence of the Brachiosaurus. The creature stood at the edge of the Jurassic sequoia grove with its neck extended upward in a curve so long, so improbable, that it entered a different register of light entirely. Down where the creature's feet rested on the jungle floor, the shadows were deep and cool and smelled of wet earth and decomposing plant matter. But up where the neck ended, up where the small head reached into the topmost branches of the towering tree to strip leaves from twigs that no other creature could reach, the light was golden warm, suffused with the haze of afternoon filtering through a canopy that was 300 feet above the ground. The extreme vertical composition of the creature, the way it demanded you tilt your head back until your neck ached before you could even begin to comprehend where it ended, was less like looking at an animal and more like looking at a landform. The rough skin texture of the neck caught the warm golden haze and threw it back in 100 different tones of ochre and tan and pale gray, and the wrinkles and folds of skin where the neck bent and flexed were as geological as the ridges of a hillside. Far below, the jungle floor was invisible, lost in the misty deep, and the sense of verticality, of sheer improbable height, created a vertigo that was not unpleasant but was entirely impossible to resist. The leaves came down as the small head pulled them free, spinning, catching the light, floating in slow spirals down through the layered canopy, and the Brachiosaurus chewed with the complete and sovereign serenity of a creature that had nothing to fear. The epic scale and grandeur of the moment was inseparable from its quietness. This was not drama. This was simply the world being what it was. Drama, when it came low and fast and wet. The Triceratops hit the river at a full charge, and the world exploded. Water sprayed in every direction in enormous sheets, catching the gray light of the overcast prehistoric sky above and fracturing it into 1,000 brief, brilliant points before falling back into the churning mud-brown current. The creature's three horns, the two great brow horns curving forward and up, the shorter nasal horn pointing straight ahead like a lance, parted the air with an authority that made the spray seem deliberate, as though the water itself were stepping aside out of respect. The frill behind those horns was a marvel of color and texture, the bone covered in skin that showed every vein and flush of blood, darkened now with the effort of the charge, a deep oxblood purple along the edges fading to cream at the center. The legs churned through the mud and water with mechanical power, and the wide-angle low ground-level perspective showed everything from below. The underside of the enormous body, the legs like moving columns, the spray arcing outward in slow-motion cascades, and behind and above it all, visible through a break in the dense tropical jungle canopy, the overcast gray prehistoric sky pressed down on the scene like a lid. The vivid green vegetation on the far bank blurred in the motion, and the power of the moment was total and physical and inescapable. The tropical jungle swallowed the sound of the charge, absorbed it, returned to its ambient murmur of insects and falling water and distant wind in the high trees, and the river closed again over the churned mud the Triceratops had left behind. Dawn came to the Cretaceous River in amber and silver, and with it came the Spinosaurus. It waded into the wide water from the eastern bank at the hour when the light was still deciding what color it wanted to be, and the mist that rose from the water surface caught the first amber illumination and held it, made it horizontal, made it a thing you could almost touch. The creature's enormous dorsal sail caught that light first. It was the highest point of the animal, reaching nearly 2 meters above the spine. Its skin stretched taut between the long neural spines in a membrane so fine you could see the tracery of blood vessels beneath it when the sun hit it from the right angle, and right now, at this precise moment of first light, the sail was backlit and translucent and extraordinary, a natural stained glass window erected in the middle of a prehistoric river at the beginning of time. The deep blue-green tones of the creature's scaly skin shifted as it waded deeper, the water rising around those massive legs and changing color where it touched, dark and disturbed where the feet pushed through the riverbed mud, pale and glittering where the current caught the falling drops from the creature's flanks. Beneath the surface, visible in the clear shallows near the bank, a school of prehistoric fish scattered in every direction, their silver bodies flashing and darting, creating a constellation of panic that spread outward from the Spinosaurus's legs in a perfectly expanding circle. The wide cinematic landscape composition of the scene, the vast river, the distant jungle on both banks, the enormous sky, and this single extraordinary creature at the center of it all, was the kind of scale that made philosophy involuntary. Evening came differently, came with color. The Stegosaurus stood at the edge of the Jurassic fern meadow as the sun descended behind the silhouetted prehistoric palms, and the sky behind the palms was a conflagration of orange and amber that poured itself across the horizon in waves. The creature was grazing with the calm satisfaction of an animal that had grazed in this meadow its entire life and expected to graze in it for a great deal longer, pulling up mouthfuls of the prehistoric ferns with methodical, unhurried movements of its small head, utterly indifferent to the spectacular meteorological performance being conducted behind it. The dorsal plates, those distinctive diamond-shaped protrusions arranged in 2 alternating rows along the spine, were the star of this particular evening. The warm backlit rim lighting turned their edges to gold and their surfaces to deep shadow, and the contrast between the lit edge and the dark face of each plate created a depth and dimensionality that made the creature look, from a distance, less like an animal and more like a piece of terrain that had decided to eat ferns. The peaceful, wide-angle composition of the scene held the meadow, the palms, the sky, and this unhurried, magnificent creature in a balance that felt less like a scene and more like a meditation. And then the rain came, and with the rain came pursuit. The Deinonychus pack had been tracking for hours. They moved through the darkening Cretaceous forest with the relentless metronomic efficiency of pack hunters that had learned the patience was the sharpest weapon. And now, with the light failing and the first drops beginning to fall through the canopy, the patience was ending and the speed was beginning. The lead raptor's feet hit the wet leaf litter and launched it skyward. The motion blur that spread backward from those taloned feet told the story of velocity more clearly than any measurement could, showing not where the foot was but where it had been and where it was going, and the blur between them that was pure, distilled speed. The rain fell in earnest now, cool blue light replacing the last of the warm afternoon gold, and the forest filled with the white noise of water on leaves and the smell of wet earth and the percussion of those rapid, powerful feet. The lead raptor's eyes were the only still thing in the composition, those fierce yellow eyes, sharp focus amid the motion, watching the prey ahead with an attention so complete it amounted to a kind of art. The cinematic chase composition opened up ahead of the pack, a corridor of misty forest receding into depth, the trees on either side blurring with motion, the destination unclear but the direction absolutely certain. The jungle absorbed them, and the rain continued to fall. In a steamy clearing not far to the east, a different kind of confrontation was reaching its climax. The Ankylosaurus had been cornered, or rather, it had allowed something resembling a corner to develop, which was not the same thing at all. The creature's armor was the most sophisticated passive defense system the Cretaceous had produced, a tessellation of bony scuts embedded in thick skin, each one a slightly different shape, the whole forming an articulated living shield that covered the animal's back and sides from the base of the neck to the base of the tail. But the tail itself was the conversation ender, and the Ankylosaurus swung it now with everything it had. The massive club, a fusion of bone and keratin at the end of a tail rigid with calcified tendons, connected with a sound that was less an impact and more an event, and the dirt and debris that exploded outward from the point of connection formed a perfect sphere of suspended particles, each one lit by the late afternoon golden sidelight, each one briefly beautiful before gravity reasserted its authority. The Allosaurus that had been pressing the attack recoiled, its balance broken, its confidence shattered, its roar becoming something closer to a yelp. The dramatic side-angle composition of the confrontation caught both animals in the same frame. The low, armored, patient herbivore and the tall, predatory, suddenly uncertain carnivore, and the dynamism of the swing, the explosive moment of impact, the photorealistic armored skin with its embedded bony scuts catching the warm sidelight, composed a scene that was equal parts violence and geometry. High above the canopy, the world was different. High above, there was wind and light and the vast indifferent blue-gray of the storm sky, and through that sky the pteranodon moved with a mastery that made everything below seem slow and heavy and earthbound. It came in low over the coastal sea cliff, wings fully spread, and fully spread meant something in the range of 7 meters, a span so wide that the membrane between the long finger bone and the body became translucent at its thinnest point, the fine network of fibers visible like the veins of a leaf held up to the light. The cliff below was jagged and dark, the prehistoric rock wet with spray from the waves that crashed against it in long, rolling detonations that sent white water 30 feet into the air before falling back in curtains of foam. The ocean itself was the color of old pewter, shifting with the weather, and the stormy sky above matched it almost exactly, so that at the horizon the two gray masses merged and became indistinguishable and the world lost its edge. The pteranodon navigated this gray immensity with the casual precision of something that had been doing it since before the concept of difficulty had been invented, banking with a tilt of the crest that functioned as a rudder, adjusting the camber of the wing with micro-movements of the fourth finger that supported the membrane. From below, from the dramatic aerial cinematic angle that caught the creature against the storm sky, its shadow falling on the churned water below, it was less an animal and more a piece of weather. The cliff fell away behind it, and the ocean opened up ahead, gray and vast and ancient, and the pteranodon climbed, riding a thermal up into the cold sky. Back in the interior, the mist was thickest at the river crossings, and at the wide shallow river that wound through the Cretaceous floodplain in long, lazy curves. The Parasaurolophus herd had been crossing since before the first light and would continue crossing well after the mist burned off. There were dozens of them, their crested heads moving in a loose, organic synchrony that was more like the motion of a river itself than the motion of individual animals. A wave-like undulation that passed from one end of the herd to the other and back again, driven by nothing more complicated than the fact that when one animal moved, those beside it felt the movement and responded. The hollow crests, those long, curved, bony tubes that swept back from the skull in an arc that made each animal look perpetually in mid-dive, were above the mist line, and below the mist the animals were half invisible, their bodies existing as suggestions, as shapes in the gray, their legs moving through the still water with barely a ripple. The reflections of the crested heads shimmered in the water's surface, imperfect doubles shifting with the current, and the soft, cool blue of the dawn light turned everything it touched into a study in restraint. It was a wide panoramic scene, the dense jungle dark on both banks, the river pale and silver and alive with slow motion, and through the middle of it all the herd moved with the patience of something that had been making this crossing every year for 1,000 years and would keep making it for 1,000 more. The jungle on the far bank was darker than it looked. The Carnotaurus had learned this about jungles early in its life, that they looked penetrable from outside, that the light on the near side of the treeline created the illusion of openness beyond, but that beyond the first rank of trees and ferns and climbing vines the darkness thickened rapidly and became something else entirely, something that had weight and temperature and a presence that pressed back against anything that moved through it. The creature emerged from this darkness into a sunlit clearing with the controlled suddenness of a thing that had timed its appearance to the second, not bursting into the light but materializing in it, stepping across the line between shadow and sun with a precision that suggested the whole performance had been choreographed. The distinctive horn-framed face was in sharp focus in the transition light, the two small brow horns casting their own shadows across the bossed forehead, and the cool shadow-to-warm light transition that played across the body as it moved forward was a revelation of texture. The subtle brown-orange camouflage patterns of the skin, so perfectly tuned to the jungle's palette that in the trees it had been invisible, were now visible as separate elements, individual patches of color and texture, that together made up a whole more complex and more beautiful than any of its parts. The tense ambush-style composition of the moment hung in the clearing air, and across the clearing, whatever had been grazing there a moment before was gone, leaving only the disturbed ferns and the silence. Overhead, a very different kind of spectacle was playing out against the pale sky. A flock of Quetzalcoatlus circled on thermals above the vast Cretaceous jungle canopy, and their scale was one of the universe's great jokes. Each individual animal had a wingspan approaching 11 meters, larger than a small aircraft, larger than anything that had flown before or since, the absolute upper limit of what biology and physics between them would permit for a flying creature. And yet they moved through the sky with the ease of things that weighed nothing at all, tilting and banking and soaring on the invisible architecture of the thermals with an effortlessness that made their size irrelevant. From above, and the perspective was aerial here, looking down through the warm orange and pink dawn sky at the creatures circling below. You could see the shadows of their enormous wingspans moving across the treetops like slow clouds, like the shadows of something even larger passing between the earth and the sun. The prehistoric landscape spread out below them in every direction, green and vast and ancient, receding into atmospheric haze at every horizon, a world without edges. In the depths of that world, in the heart of a dark and rainy jungle where no Quetzalcoatlus shadow ever reached, the politics of predation were playing out on an intimate scale. The juvenile T-Rex was small by the standards of what it would become, though already large by the standards of almost anything else alive in the Cretaceous, and it had learned the first and most important lesson of its kind, that the world was divided into two categories, things you could eat and things that could eat you, and that the boundary between those categories was not fixed but was instead a moving line that changed depending on your size and your hunger and your health and the quality of the decision you made in the next few seconds. The juvenile crouched behind the massive fallen tree trunk, the rain streaking down through the dark air in fine silver lines, its wet skin glistening where the dim light found it, and watched through the gap between the trunk and the ground as its parent hunted in the clearing beyond. The parent moved differently than the juvenile, slower in some ways, more deliberate, each step placed with a precision born of experience rather than caution. And the dark, moody atmosphere of the jungle, the rain reducing visibility to shades of gray and darker gray, made the parent's movements seem almost ghostly, a suggestion of enormous predatory purpose moving through the wet dark. The emotional cinematic storytelling of the moment was not in the hunt. It was in the watcher, in the small yellow eyes fixed on the large form beyond the log, learning, absorbing, storing, becoming. Across the valley, a very different lesson was being taught, though it required no teacher and no pupil and no rein. The Gallimimus herd ran because running was what they were built for, and the wide-open prehistoric plain they were crossing was, from their body's point of view, exactly the terrain their legs had evolved to traverse. There were hundreds of them in the herd, and from a distance, from the long-lens cinematic perspective that compressed the plain and the herd into a single dense composition, they became a single organism, dozens of pairs of legs moving in synchronized waves, the rhythm of their feet creating a sound that was less percussion and more weather, a low constant roar of impact against dry earth that spread outward in all directions. The golden dust cloud they raised behind them climbed into the warm late afternoon light and hung there, self-lit and beautiful, a monument to their passing. The long grass of the Jurassic grassland setting bent away from them as they passed through it, and bent back after, and the plain returned to its wide, sun-warmed quiet. Quiet arrived at the lake just before the light did. The iguanodon was standing at the edge of the misty Cretaceous lake in the gray diffused overcast light when the world seemed to hold its breath. And in that moment of held breath, the still water of the lake was a mirror so perfect it seemed less like water and more like a second sky laid flat, reflecting the creature and the surrounding prehistoric jungle with such fidelity that the boundary between the real and the reflected was genuinely difficult to locate. The creature itself was feeding on the low ferns at the water's edge with a tranquility that the mist seemed designed to protect, pulling each mouthful from the wet fronds with the same unhurried precision it had been applying since morning, its large eyes half-lidded with something that looked, from a safe and respectful distance, like contentment. The overcast soft diffused lighting flattened the shadows and softened the textures and turned the whole scene into something that felt less like a moment and more like a memory, something half-recalled, already receding, already beautiful in the way that only receding things can be. The lake held its breath a moment longer, and then a wind came off the far bank and broke the reflection into 1,000 moving pieces, and the iguanodon raised its head and looked at nothing in particular for a long moment before going back to the ferns. Not far away, at the entrance to a cave that opened into the dark hillside like a wound, the Dilophosaurus was announcing itself to the world in the most spectacular terms available to it. The neck frill had been folded flat against the creature's neck for most of the day. It was a metabolically expensive structure to keep extended, and the Dilophosaurus was efficient in the way that all successful predators are efficient, expending no more energy than the situation required. But the situation now required the frill, and the frill responded with a speed and completeness that transformed the creature's profile from that of a moderately sized Jurassic predator into something that looked, to any nervous system tuned to pattern recognition, like a much larger and much angrier predator. The vibrant red and orange of the fully extended frill was shocking in the cool cave shadow light that fell from behind it. The contrast between the dark cave entrance and the vividly colored frill, between the shadow and the jungle light that fell from the front, gave the frill a translucency that made its fine membrane texture visible, the tiny blood vessels and structural fibers catching the light and turning the whole structure into something simultaneously delicate and terrifying. The dramatic low-angle close-up captured the full confrontational geometry of the display. The two crests on the skull above, the enormous frill below, the small but precisely proportioned body between them, and the cave mouth behind, and the sense that whatever was looking at this display was being invited to reconsider its life choices with some urgency. The Dilophosaurus held the display for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than necessary, because it was a theatrical animal in a world that had not yet invented theater. In the Jurassic forest to the north, a different predator had already concluded its performance and was now engaged in the less theatrical but equally serious business of the aftermath. The Allosaurus crouched over its kill in the dense Jurassic forest with its head raised and alert, blood dark on its jaws, eyes moving across the shadowed treeline with the systematic attention of an animal that knew that a successful hunt attracted other hunters. The moody green and shadow tones of the surrounding jungle absorbed and swallowed everything beyond a certain distance. Shapes became suggestions, suggestions became darkness, and out of that darkness a Diplodocus was visible for just a moment. A massive gray shape moving away through the fog, moving fast for something so large, the vegetation closing behind it with a swish and a settling of disturbed fronds. The Allosaurus watched it go. The prey on the ground was enough. For now, the prey on the ground was enough, and the forest could keep its giants for another day. The Diplodocus herd it had been watching was downstream now, at the wide Jurassic River, in the long amber light of sunset, bending those impossible necks to the water with the grace of something that had evolved specifically for this moment. The water surface caught the orange and gold of the sky and threw it back in fragments, and the necks of the Diplodocuses bent down through that light and broke the reflection when they reached the water and sent gentle ripples outward in slow, expanding rings. There were a dozen of them, spread across 100 meters of riverbank, each one a variation on the same theme of extraordinary length and strange, backward-swept elegance, and together they composed a scene of such uncomplicated magnificence that even the amber and gold of the sunset seemed to recognize that it was playing a supporting role. The layered jungle backdrop was dark and rich behind them, and the wide, peaceful composition of the scene held everything in balance. The enormous animals, the glowing river, the burning sky, the patient, ancient trees, and for a moment the world was simply beautiful, completely and without qualification beautiful, and it did not need to be anything else. Nearby, in the soft blue light before the morning sun had fully decided to commit to the day, the Truden pair were doing something that required all the stillness the world could provide. They moved with an exactness that seemed almost painful, each foot placed with the care of a surgeon, each shift of weight telegraphed in advance by a slight change in posture, each movement the product of a calculation that had happened before the movement began rather than during it. The clutch of eggs in the mossy nest on the jungle floor was the reason for all this care, though it did not look like eggs so much as a small collection of smooth white stones, each one nestled in the moss with what appeared to be deliberate arrangement. The dewdrops on the surrounding ferns caught the early morning light and held it, each drop a tiny complete world, and the detailed feathered skin texture of the Truden pair caught the same light and scattered it in a way that made their feathers seem less like a covering and more like a conversation with the light itself. The intimacy of the ground-level composition brought the scale down from the vast and geological to the small and specific, to the details that made large things possible. The careful tending, the patient waiting, the small warm things that would, in time, become something extraordinary. The extraordinary, when it arrived with a roar. The Carcharodontosaurus stood on the near bank of the wide steaming Cretaceous River and roared at its rival on the far bank. And the rival, equally enormous, equally magnificent, equally certain of its own invincibility, roared back. The river between them was wide and turbulent and threw up small clouds of steam from the warm water meeting the cooler air above, and the surfaces of both creatures were reflected in the churning current in the way that only violence is reflected. Fragmented, shifting, never quite resolving into a recognizable image. The thunderstorm sky that pressed down on the scene was the color of bruises and bad decisions, and at the horizon, visible above the dark line of the far jungle, a lightning bolt rode itself across the sky in a single white stroke and was gone before the eye was done reading it. The sound reached both animals a moment later, adding its percussion to their own, and the confrontation at the water's edge became something larger than just two predators. It became a conversation between scales, between the geological and the biological, between the storm and the living things that had no choice but to exist inside it. High above both animals, above the storm, above the river, above the jungle, the Mammachosaurus was doing the thing it did best, which was simply being impossibly long. Its neck arced upward through a break in the forest canopy with the slow inevitability of a geological process. Not moving so much as continuing, the neck's motion too gradual and too vast to be called movement in any ordinary sense. From directly below, looking up through layers of prehistoric fronds and ancient fern branches and the complex, shadowed architecture of the canopy, the neck rose through successive layers of green and gold, each layer more sunlit than the last, until at the very top, visible through the last layer of foliage, the pale face of the sky waited with all the patience that empty spaces have. The wrinkles and creases in the neck's skin where it bent and flexed were each a small landscape, a topography of age and use and magnificent purpose, and the golden hazy sky above the foliage turned the uppermost section of the neck into a silhouette that was also somehow a sculpture, a form existing simultaneously as biology and as art. Art of a different kind was being practiced in the shadowed depths of the Cretaceous forest where the Therizinosaurus stood with its impossibly long blade-like claws extended toward a tree trunk, stripping the bark and leaves with movements that were, for all their power, surprisingly deliberate. The claws, each one over a meter long, curved slightly, the keratin surface with a texture like old ivory, were the most extraordinary structures in the Cretaceous, produced by evolution with a purpose that seemed, at first consideration, entirely mismatched with the creature's gentle, methodical feeding behavior. But the claws worked, and they worked with a precision that their size made paradoxical. Each strip of bark came away clean, each cluster of leaves was gathered with a selectivity that suggested the animal knew the difference between what it wanted and what it did not. The golden afternoon light filtered through the canopy in long, warm shafts, and where those shafts caught the claws they turned the keratin to amber, and the curious, gentle posture of the enormous creature, head slightly tilted, movements unhurried, contrasted with the size of everything about it in a way that was quietly, stubbornly moving. The gentleness was not universal. Somewhere to the south, in the gray light that preceded a storm, the Pachycephalosaurus pair had found each other on a rocky hillside and had determined, through whatever calculus of posture and hormone and territorial necessity they employed, that the dispute between them could not be resolved through negotiation. They hit each other head-on with a force that made the rock beneath their feet vibrate, and the dust and pebbles that exploded upward from the impact zone formed a brief, perfect sphere of suspended debris, each particle lit from below by the amber and ochre of the rocky terrain. The distinctive domed skull of each animal, that extraordinary thickened cranial structure that was essentially nature's crash helmet, evolved precisely for this moment, for this repeated percussive ceremony of territorial assertion, absorbed the impact with a sound that was organic and geological and somehow musical all at once. The surrounding ferns trembled. The ancient trees on the hilltop shed a few loose leaves. The two animals separated, shook their heads, assessed each other, and prepared to meet again. The assessment, when it required different data, looked seaward. At the surface of the Cretaceous Sea, the violence arrived from below. The Mosasaurus was not a small animal. It was not a thing that could be described with ordinary language or contained by ordinary proportions. It was something that occupied the same conceptual space as a submarine and a nightmare simultaneously, and it broke the surface of the dusk-lit sea with an energy that seemed disproportionate even for its size. The explosion of water around its emerging body was vast and theatrical, a cascade of white water and spray that caught the orange-red of the evening sky and fragmented it into a million brief lights before falling back into the churning surface. The jaws, already open, already in motion, already committed to the physics of the strike, closed on the pteranodon with a completeness that left no ambiguity about the outcome. The sky above was reflected in the churning ocean surface in fragments of orange and red and dark, and the cinematic splash composition of the moment captured the full Baroque extravagance of it. The erupting water, the great jaws, the doomed wings, the burning sky, in a single frame that was equal parts catastrophe and spectacle. The sea closed over the disturbance. The waves continued their ancient argument with the shore. The sky darkened toward night. Night came to the ancient world not as an absence of light but as a different kind of light. The cool blue-silver of stars and moon, the green-black of wet foliage, the amber memory of the vanished sun still visible at the horizon for a few minutes before the darkness became total and the world belonged entirely to the animals that had evolved to navigate it. The T-Rex family moved through the dark jungle with the confidence of creatures that needed no light because they carried their own authority, the parents' footfalls regular and measured, the juveniles' smaller steps falling in the gaps between them, the two of them moving through the Cretaceous night as a unit, as a shared project, as an argument that the world was worth inheriting. A different argument was being made the next morning in the Cretaceous Valley, and it was being made by numbers alone. The Argentinosaurus herd occupied the valley in the way that a geological event occupies a valley, with a completeness that was less a matter of individual animals and more a matter of volume, of mass, of an overwhelming plurality that rewrote the scale of everything around it. From the aerial bird's-eye perspective, the full extent of the herd was visible against the vast green landscape below. The long necks and enormous bodies arranged in loose groupings that covered the valley floor from the fern meadows in the south to the cycad groves in the north, the atmospheric haze at the distance making the northernmost animals ghostly, and the warm midday light turning the near animals into a study in photorealistic skin texture and shadow. Between the animals, the ferns and cycad trees were invisible beneath the volume of what stood above them, and the slow, collective, continent-shifting movement of the herd from one end of the valley to the other was less like watching animals and more like watching a tectonic event in real time. The individual, in such context, required intimacy to recover its particularity, and intimacy arrived at the Cretaceous lake just before noon when the Pachycephalosaurus found its own reflection. The creature stood at the water's edge with its domed head tilted at an angle that was purely, unmistakably curious. The kind of tilt that living things perform when they encounter something they cannot immediately classify, when the information being received does not fit comfortably into any existing category. The reflection in the smooth surface of the lake matched the tilt perfectly, of course, which must have been confusing in its own right. The dome angling one way, the reflected dome angling the other, each precisely matching the other's movement in the way that mirrors do and that other individuals do not. The warm afternoon light came in at a low angle across the water and turned the surface to near solid gold at the edges, deepening to a clear transparency at the center where the reflection was most perfect, and the intimate behavioral portrait composition held the real animal and its double in a dialogue that seemed, from the outside, to be conducted entirely in the language of uncertainty. What the Pachycephalosaurus made of its reflection, it kept to itself, as all interesting thinkers do. Elsewhere, more straightforward conversations were in progress. The Carcharodontosaurus and the Spinosaurus occupied a shared riverbank at the boundary of their territories, two apex predators, different in strategy and in shape, assessing each other across 10 meters of Cretaceous mud with the focused attention that top-tier predators reserve for the only things in the world that pose them meaningful competition. The Spinosaurus was taller, the sail adding nearly 2 meters to its already impressive profile, and the Carcharodontosaurus was more massively built, its skull larger and its jaws more powerful, and they stood in the warm afternoon light at the water's edge and read each other with their eyes and nostrils and the subtle postural language of apex predators who have no evolutionary context for backing down but have learned, over time, that some confrontations are worth more as standoffs than as battles. The behavioral standoff at the water's edge had the quality of a negotiation conducted in a language that neither party could fully articulate but both understood completely. Above the negotiation, the sky was busy with its own choreography. The pteranodon banked in a thermal above the coastal cliff, the physics of its flight made visible in the stress patterns of the wing membrane. Not wrinkles exactly, but a fine distributed tension that showed, to anyone who understood what they were seeing, the precise interplay of aerodynamic forces acting across the surface. The crest functioned as a rudder, shifting the airflow around the rear of the skull and tilting the animal's heading with a precision that no artificial rudder of the same size could match. The warm afternoon thermals above the Cretaceous coastal cliff were invisible but structured, rising in columns above the sun-heated rock, and the pteranodon navigated between them with the easy fluency of a creature that had been doing this since before the memory of the sky. The sky remembered everything. It kept its record in fossils and in stone, in the chalk cliffs that were even now, while these animals lived and breathed and flew and fed, being slowly built from the compressed remains of countless tiny organisms settling onto the seafloor in slow snow. A pteranodon skeleton, preserved in that chalk with a perfection that time would be unable to improve upon, waited in its cliff for the erosion that would eventually reveal it, the wave already undermining the chalk face, the ancient bones already close to the surface, the moment of discovery already scheduled in the geological calendar. The realistic geological color of the chalk, the cool coastal light, the patience of deep time. All of it already present, already arranged, waiting for no one. But the living world was not patient. It was urgent and loud and wet and immediate. The Triceratops herd moving through the dense Cretaceous forest had closed itself into a protective formation around its calves with the smooth efficiency of a behavior learned and rehearsed across many generations. The adults arranged in a loose circle, the calves at the center, the horns pointed outward, the massive frills creating a visual barrier between the vulnerable interior of the herd and whatever moved between the dark trees on either side. The darkness between the trees was real darkness, genuine and deep, the canopy above dense enough to exclude most of the afternoon light, and within that darkness shapes moved without announcing themselves, implied by the formation of the herd rather than directly visible, their presence argued for by the tight posture of the adult Triceratops and the stillness of the calves. The calm efficiency of the protective behavior was in some ways more impressive than any act of individual aggression. It was a collective decision made continuously and silently, adjusting in real time to the changing geometry of the threat, each animal contributing its piece of the whole with no coordination visible from outside. It was only from above, from the perspective of the vast distances above the canopy where the Quetzalcoatl still circled, that the forest could be seen as what it was, a tapestry of green and shadow, an enormously complex ecosystem in which every individual drama was simultaneously happening and invisible, simultaneous and separate, each creature absorbed in its own urgent present while the whole of the prehistoric world proceeded at its own geological pace around them. The geological pace had its own dramas. In the far south, where the volcanic highlands rose above the Cretaceous jungle in a series of increasingly violent geological gestures, the Giganotosaurus moved through a landscape of geothermal vents and sulfurous steam, its enormous form navigating the alien terrain with the pragmatic indifference of an apex predator that had seen worse. The vents steamed in clusters around the creature's feet, the pale gas rising and dispersing in the volcanic highland air, and the landscape was orange and gray and deeply strange, the vegetation here different from the lowland jungle, sparser, tougher, adapted to the geothermal soil chemistry, and the Giganotosaurus's scale was visible against the enormous geological features in a way that it was not when surrounded by the dense jungle below, where the trees provided a constant reference point. Here, in the open, against the vast volcanic formations, the predator was both enormous and small simultaneously, a biological fact making its way across a geological canvas that had no particular interest in whether biological facts existed or not. The canvas had its own preoccupations. In the far north, the Herosaurus herd moved through a Triassic volcanic landscape that made the Cretaceous volcanic highlands look restrained by comparison. The eruption on the horizon was not a background detail but a geological event of the first order. The ash column rising to heights that altered the local weather, the orange glow of the lava visible even in daylight, the atmosphere heavy with particles that softened the sun and turned the light amber and strange. These were the earliest dinosaurs, the pioneers, the first attempts at the form, and they moved through their volcanic world with the unself-conscious confidence of creatures that did not know they were the beginning of anything, did not know that the forms they carried in their bodies contained, like compressed springs, the entire future of terrestrial vertebrate life. The geological spectacle behind them dwarfed them and indifferent to them, and they navigated it because it was what the world was and there was no other world available. The world that was available, across the many millions of years of the Mesozoic, was one of constant negotiation between body and environment, and nowhere was this negotiation more beautifully embodied than in the creatures that had taken to water. The Suchomimus stood in the wide prehistoric river at midday with its long crocodilian snout submerged to the nostrils, the crystal-clear shallow water revealing the rocky riverbed in precise detail beneath the surface, the shadows of the creature's legs extending across that riverbed in clear, dark parallel lines. The warm overhead sun came straight down through the water column and illuminated the riverbed with an evenness that the aerial and raking light of morning and evening could not achieve. It was the honest, democratic light of noon, showing everything equally, hiding nothing, and in that light the patience of the Suchomimus was fully visible, every detail of the long wait captured. The still snout just below the surface, the slow drift of water plants past the motionless legs, the occasional, quick shadow of a fish passing through the frame. Waiting was a kind of work. The Suchomimus was very good at it. The fish that avoided the Suchomimus in the wide river found no safety in the lake. The Spinosaurus that waded into the water at night found its own version of patience in the moonlight, or perhaps patience was the wrong word. Perhaps what the Spinosaurus found in the cool blue-silver night, standing in the wide river delta with its enormous sail silver in the moonlight and its reflection ghost-like in the rippling water below, was something closer to belonging. The sail caught the light of the full Cretaceous moon and held it, and the moonlit rippling water reflected the whole extraordinary silhouette back imperfectly, the reflection shimmering and shifting with each small current, making the creature's image into something dreamlike and fluid while the creature itself stood solid and still and sovereign in the middle of its river. The ethereal night scene had a quality of the sacred about it, though sacredness was a concept that would not be invented for another 65 million years. The feeling it described was already present and nameable in this moment, in the moonlit water and the silver sail and the ancient empty sky. The sky was not always empty. Sometimes it was full of purpose, full of the specific, directed purpose of the Deinonychus hunting, not alone this time and not with its own kind, but in an unlikely coordination with a Trudon, two different species, different sizes, different strategies, united in this moment by the logic of the hunt and the calculus of need. The large iguanodon ahead of them moved through the Cretaceous forest with the nervousness of an animal that had been aware of pursuit for the past hour without being able to resolve it into a specific threat, and the coordination between its two pursuers was not communication so much as parallel intelligence, two different cognitive styles arriving at the same tactical conclusion from different directions. The Deinonychus would drive, the Trudon would flank, and the outcome would depend on variables that neither animal had words for but both understood completely. The afternoon golden light through the forest turned the pursuit into a study in contrasts. The large herbivore's anxiety, the two predators' calm, and the scientific behavioral scene had a quality of fascination that went beyond the individual drama to touch something larger, something about the way that intelligence, when it is real, finds its expression not in solitude but in the difficult, rewarding work of cooperation. The work of the world was everywhere and constant. In the Cretaceous floodplain, the T-Rex and its juvenile stood together at sunrise, both heads raised into the amber light of early morning, both nostrils reading the same air for the same information, though what the juvenile understood from the reading and what the adult understood were still different things. This was the lesson, not the content of the scent, not the identification of the distant prey, but the act of learning to read, the development of the capacity to extract meaning from the world's continuous data stream. The amber dawn light lay across both animals in warm, equitable panels, and the photorealistic family behavioral scene had the quality of a portrait. Not a posed portrait but a found one, a moment caught mid-action that happened to be composed with the precision of something arranged. The quiet and the instructiveness of the moment were inseparable from each other. This was how the world perpetuated itself, not through genetics alone but through the patient transmission of knowledge from those who had it to those who needed it. Knowledge of a different kind was distributed across the landscape of the Cretaceous mountain pass, where the Parasaurolophus herd was making its crossing between two valleys in the cool high-altitude morning light. The crested heads were visible in silhouette against the pale sky above the pass, lined up along the ridge like a row of strange instruments, the hollow crests pointing backward in their characteristic gesture that was part anatomy and part acoustics, the structures capable of producing sounds that carried across vast distances and communicated information about identity and location and emotional state with a fidelity that language, when it eventually arrived, would take a long time to match. The wide panoramic mountain landscape held the pass and the herd in an epic scale composition, the animals small against the rock formations, the sky above them pale and high and cold, and the sense of the migration, the long journey, the ancient route, the yearly repetition of a route that had been walked by their ancestors' gave the scene a weight that went beyond the visual, beyond the immediate, into something that felt like time itself. Time, in the late Cretaceous, was running out. But no animal that walked or flew or swam in the ancient world had the ability to read that particular clock, and so they moved through their days with the full conviction of permanence, with the confidence of creatures embedded in a world that had always been and would always be exactly as it was. The Triceratops bull standing in the center of the vast Cretaceous wildflower meadow in full bloom had no knowledge that the flowers around him, vivid prehistoric species in colors that no human eye would ever see fresh, were among the newest innovations in the history of plant life, the flowering plants still young enough to be a revolution. He stood in the center of the revolution with the complete indifference of the armored and the ancient, and the incongruity between the vivid wildflower meadow and the massive, horned, frill-collared creature at its center was not incongruity at all but simply the world being larger and more various than any single creature's experience of it could encompass. It was always larger. That was the lesson the world kept teaching, and that its inhabitants kept forgetting, and that it kept teaching again, endlessly patient, the way that only large things are patient. In the river delta at the edge of the continent, the Carnotaurus was swimming at twilight with its distinctive horned face barely above the waterline. The deep orange sky reflected in the dark water around it, creating the impression that the creature was swimming through fire. Its characteristic short arms, the most vestigial limbs in the Cretaceous, were held against its sides in the water, irrelevant to the swimming, which was accomplished entirely by the powerful sweep of the tail. The swimming was itself a kind of statement about the adaptability of form, that this animal, built entirely for land pursuit, could navigate the water with sufficient competence to make river crossings possible when the prey required them. The mysterious and atmospheric semi-aquatic predator scene had the quality of something seen at the edge of sleep, something real but at the boundary of legibility, the known animal in an unfamiliar context. Familiarity arrived with the morning herd. The Camarasaurus herd had chosen the wide Jurassic River as their midday refuge from the summer heat, and they stood in it with the placid satisfaction of creatures for whom a river was not a barrier or a threat, but simply a convenient temperature management solution. Their long necks rose above the water's surface in the warm golden midday light like the necks of enormous swans, and the pastoral and peaceful wide scene had a quality of civilization about it. Not civilization in the human sense, but in the older sense of a society that had worked out, through trial and error across many generations, the most efficient and comfortable way to exist in the world available to it. The river was their comfort. The herd was their context. The midday heat was a manageable inconvenience. They stood in their river and were content, and the world was large around them and warm, and this was enough. Enough, and then more, always the world insisting on its own excess, on the surplus of spectacle that was not spectacle at all but simply nature operating at its full capacity. The Diplodocus herd at the river, the Argentinosaurus valley, the Quetzalcoatlus circling on thermals, the Mosasaurus in the clear shallows visible from the cliff above, all of them operating simultaneously, all of them contributing to the great roaring complexity of the Cretaceous world, a world so fully, so insistently alive that silence, in any corner of it, was always temporary. The temporary silence at the base of the ancient Cretaceous redwood forest lasted about 30 seconds before the T-Rex's footfall broke it. The redwoods were 3 times the creature's height, which meant they were enormous because the creature was enormous, but the mathematics of the comparison worked out to something genuinely startling when you stood in the forest and looked up and then looked down and tried to hold both scales in mind simultaneously. The trees reduced the predator to something approaching approachable, something that existed in a scale relationship with the world around it that was, for once, not defined by absolute dominance. The soft, diffused cathedral light that fell through the enormous trunks turned the forest floor into a space of deep green shadow and long golden shafts, and the T-Rex moved through these alternating bands of light and dark with the slow, deliberate pace of an animal that was not hunting, or had already hunted and was now simply moving through the world because moving through the world was what you did. The scale reversal scene had the quality of a philosophical proposition. That magnitude is always relative, always dependent on what surrounds it, always a conversation between a figure and its ground. The ground, at the end of everything, at the final panoramic reckoning of the day, the long afternoon light coming in warm and golden across the full Cretaceous ecosystem in a single wide frame, held more life than any single perception could accommodate. The sauropods in the river, their long necks visible above the surface, the slow current parting around their legs. The pterosaurs in the sky, circling on the thermals above the canopy. The hadrosaurs in the meadow, their crested heads moving in that characteristic undulating rhythm as they grazed through the late afternoon. The T-Rex on the ridge above all of it, standing against the amber sky in the posture of something that has climbed to the highest point available to it and looked out at everything below and found it, in its complexity and its beauty and its violence and its gentleness and its terrible, magnificent, temporary completeness, simply and absolutely sufficient. The world breathed. The sun moved toward the horizon. The shadows grew long. And deep in the jungle, below the great canopy that filtered the last of the light into green and gold, an egg began to move. It was a small, precise movement, a hairline fracture appearing in the shell, a tiny wet pressure applied from inside, a first announcement of the immense intention contained in the small object. The velociraptor egg had been attended for weeks, and the mother's face above it now, watching with those fierce yellow eyes softened by something that had no name in the language of the Cretaceous, was the face of the world at its most ancient and most fundamental work. The wet feathered form inside the shell pressed against the crack and widened it, the tiny beak working at the barrier between one world and another, and the photorealistic wet hatchling feather detail and the eggshell fragments falling away were simultaneously the most intimate and the most universal thing in the ancient world, because every life that had ever been lived had begun in a moment exactly like this one, the darkness giving way to light, the contained giving way to the vast, the possible becoming the actual, the future arriving as the present always does, small and wet and very much alive. The crack widened. The light came in. And in the east, beyond the jungle, beyond the river, beyond the coastal cliffs where the pteranodon flew and the mosasaurus hunted and the chalk was building its slow record of everything that had ever lived and fallen and settled and been remembered, the sun was already preparing its entrance for the next day, pulling color up toward the horizon in long bands of orange and pink and gold, rehearsing for the morning it would deliver to the creatures who had not yet been born and to those who were being born right now and to those who had already lived their entire lives in this brief, brilliant, extraordinary epoch and had never once considered themselves lucky, because luck requires the knowledge of alternatives, and the Cretaceous had no alternatives. It had only itself, complete and sufficient and alive. The light that came after the egg came slowly, the way all important things come, not all at once but in stages, each stage requiring the previous one and making the next one possible, a chain of small illuminations that added up, eventually, to something complete. The velociraptor hatchling was wet and trembling and impossibly small, its feathers plastered flat against its body by the fluid of the shell, its eyes open and enormous in the tiny face, taking in the world with an attention that was partly instinct and partly something that looked, from the outside, remarkably like wonder. The mother's face above was a landscape of scales and attention, those fierce yellow eyes steady and warm and entirely focused on the small, wet, new thing at her feet. The close-up composition held the two of them, the ancient and the newborn, the experienced and the utterly innocent, in a frame that was the world's oldest story told in the world's oldest language, and the warm light that fell across the nest and the broken shell and the wet-feathered hatchling turned everything it touched to gold, the way that certain kinds of attention always do. The hatchling made its first sound. It was not a roar. It was barely a sound at all. A thin, high, uncertain note that carried nothing of the confidence the creature would one day possess. That was entirely a question rather than an answer. But the mother heard it, and she lowered her head, and the question found its response in the warmth and solidity of her presence. And the Cretaceous jungle absorbed the small drama the way it absorbed everything, completely without comment, continuing its own enormous life around the small and the new. Small things grew. The jungle knew this better than anything. In the green depths where the light came down in moving, dappled columns through the fern canopy, a different kind of small thing was being conducted with the gravity and focus of something large. The pack of juvenile velociraptors had found a large prehistoric beetle, a magnificent, armored creature, its carapace a deep iridescent blue-black that caught the dappled light and threw it back in flashes. And they had arranged themselves around it in a loose circle and were engaged in a game that was also practice, that was play and education and social bonding all at once. The beetle moved with the dignified, purposeful pace of an insect that had been navigating forest floors since before any of these young predators' ancestors had existed, and it was utterly indifferent to the batting forepaws and the quick, darting movements around it. Each juvenile in turn would make a precise, controlled strike at the beetle with a forepaw, sending it skittering across the leaf litter, and the other juveniles would track its motion and reposition, and then another would strike, and the beetle would move again, and the soft dappled light of the Cretaceous forest clearing fell across the whole performance with the impartial warmth of light that does not distinguish between the important and the trivial because it has not yet been told the difference. The insect was in sharp detail at the center of the composition, each segment of the carapace and each antenna rendered with the photorealistic precision of something that had been alive for 300 million years and had earned, through sheer persistence, the right to be looked at carefully. The careful look was everywhere available if you knew how to look. The Trudent's curiosity about its own reflection was not a unique pathology but a general disposition. The Cretaceous world was full of minds that were always at the edge of something, always pressing against the boundary of what they understood, always finding in the world some detail that resisted easy categorization. The reflected dome in the smooth lake surface had provided one kind of mirror. The Kentrosaurus defending itself in the dense prehistoric thicket provided another. A mirror not of appearance but of capacity, the spikes bristling in the low defensive posture showing the animal itself what it was capable of, what it could become under pressure, what it had always been but only now fully expressed. The predators circling it were small by the standard of the Cretaceous's largest threats, but small was a relative concept when the animals in question had talons and teeth in numbers, and the Kentrosaurus had learned through its body's own experience that numbers required to be taken seriously regardless of the size of the individual. It moved with a slowness that was not hesitation but calculation, keeping its spikes angled toward the greatest concentration of threat, its low defensive posture distributing its weight across all four legs and lowering its center of gravity with the intuitive physics of an animal that had been practicing this maneuver since it could stand. The dappled forest light caught each spike and threw a narrow shadow, and the surrounding predators, visible as blurred motion around the central, sharply rendered herbivore, moved in and retreated and moved again in the flickering rhythm of animals that had not yet decided whether the risk was worth it. The detailed spike and plate texture of the Kentrosaurus caught every available photon and returned it as evidence of what happened when evolution was given enough time to develop a really good idea. Good ideas in the Cretaceous tended to involve water. The Allosaurus discovered this the hard way. The Jurassic River in flood was a different river from the one that ran in its banks in the dry season. It was wider, faster, more opaque, carrying in its brown turbid current the evidence of everything that had happened upstream. The rain, the landslides, the uprooted trees, the dissolved soil from 100 hillsides. The Allosaurus had entered the river at what had appeared, from the bank, to be a manageable crossing point, and was now, midstream, discovering that the current had opinions about its progress that were incompatible with its own. The water roiled around its body with an energy that was impersonal and absolute, pushing against the predator's flanks with a force that had no regard for the fact that it was a predator, that it was powerful, that it was accustomed to being the thing that decided outcomes. The gray floodstorm sky pressed down on the scene, and on the far bank, safely, drilly, with the uncomplicated relief of creatures that had crossed before the flood rose, the Diplodocus herd stood and watched. Their long necks were all oriented in the same direction, all focused on the struggling animal in the river, and there was in their collective posture something that might have been interpreted as interest or concern, or simply the automatic attention that large herd animals direct toward anomalies in the landscape. Whatever it was, it did not translate into action. The river was the Allosaurus's problem, and the Diplodocus herd had their own problems, and the floodstorm sky connected them all indifferently. The sky connected everything. This was one of the things you learned when you spent enough time in the ancient world, that the sky was not a background but a participant, as active and as consequential as any creature on the ground below it. The storm that had been building since morning broke at midday over the coastal plain where the Tyrannosaurus rex was wading through floodwaters, and the water that had already risen to the creature's knees was still rising, creeping up the scaled legs with an indifference to hierarchy that was, in its way, one of the Cretaceous world's more honest statements about the actual structure of power. The rain fell in gray sheets that reduced visibility to the nearest 30 meters, and the lightning that periodically illuminated the scene turned everything for a fraction of a second into a photographic negative. The creature's wet skin glistening silver white, the floodwater bright and turbulent, the dark jungle beyond the plain a flat black wall. Between lightning strikes the world was gray and loud and wet, and the T-Rex moved through it with its characteristic refusal to acknowledge that conditions had changed. Water cascaded off its massive body with each step, falling from the jaw and the short forelimbs and the ridge of the skull in streams and rivers of its own, and the dramatic power and scale of the composition was inseparable from the rain's persistent comment on it. The rain spoke to the river, and the river spoke to the sea, and the sea spoke to the sky, and the sky spoke to the rain, and the conversation had been going on since before any of the creatures in it had arrived and would continue long after all of them were gone. The gone arrived in the Cretaceous incrementally. The chalk cliffs recorded them as they went, the settling organisms, the compressed layers, the slow geological ledger of everything that had lived and died in the water above. A fossil in those cliffs, caught in the middle of its own formation, was not yet a fossil. It was still a recently vacated shape in the rock, still warm with the ghost of its subject, still close enough to life that the distinction between the two felt more administrative than absolute. The pteranodon skeleton preserved in the Cretaceous chalk cliff faced the ocean it had flown over in life from the cliff face, its bones still articulated, still arranged in the posture of a creature that had simply stopped mid-motion and become permanent. The eroding wave was doing what waves had always done, removing what was temporary, revealing what was lasting, and in the cool coastal light the ancient bones had a color that was both gray and warm, both mineral and organic, both end and beginning. All beginnings required an end of something else. The Carcharodontosaurus on the Cretaceous volcanic highland had found its meal and was consuming it with the focused efficiency of an apex predator that did not perform for an audience and did not require ceremony. The geothermal vents around it steamed upward in pale columns that the wind caught and dispersed, and the landscape was alien in its orange and gray volcanic palette. Not the green world of the lowland jungle, but the older, harder world of the rock, the world that had been here before the first plant and would be here after the last animal. The predator's scale against the huge geological features was a different kind of scale relationship than the jungle provided. The jungle scale was alive and responsive, changing with the seasons, growing and falling. The volcanic highland scale was geological and permanent, indifferent in the deepest sense of the word. Permanence, paradoxically, was most visible in the most transient things. In the moment of the Gorgosaurus erupting from the Cretaceous River during a crossing, the water cascade frozen in a detail so precise that each individual droplet was a world unto itself, a lens, a prism, a brief and perfect sphere of physical law. The Lambeosaurus it had ambushed was struggling with the particular desperation of an animal that had been surprised by something it had no protocol for, and the Gorgosaurus held its acquisition with the authority of something that had executed this maneuver many times and would execute it many times more. The afternoon amber light fell across the scene with gorgeous indifference, turning the exploding water to gold and the predator's wet scales to copper and the herbivore's distress to something that was, from a sufficient aesthetic distance, simply part of the world's great and terrible beauty. Beauty had no preferred subject. It distributed itself without moral commentary across the whole of the Cretaceous world, across the violence and the gentleness, the solitary and the collective, the newborn and the ancient. A Brachiosaurus using its neck to gently push a small predator away from its calf was as beautiful as any hunt, perhaps more so, because the gentleness was unexpected and the scale of the gesture. That enormous neck deployed not as a battering ram but as a careful, directed pressure, calibrated to discourage rather than destroy, said something about the complexity of large creatures that simple size could not express. The predator recoiling from the next pressure was not harmed, merely redirected, and the wide protective parent action composition caught the Jurassic clearing in afternoon light that fell warm and amber across the family group and the retreating threat and the ferns still trembling from the disturbance, and the whole scene resolved into something that felt, against all expectation, like tenderness. The Cretaceous had a gift for the unexpected resolution. In the high mountain valleys where the Parasaurolophus herd had descended from their mountain pass crossing, the acoustics changed. The peaks compressed the sound and focused it, and the hollow crests of the hadrosaurs, already remarkable instruments, became in that acoustic environment something extraordinary. The low, resonant calls they produced as they descended into the valley spread in waves through the cold mountain air and bounced off the rock faces and returned transformed, layered, harmonically enriched by the stone. The pale sky of the cool high-altitude morning was above them, and the panoramic mountain landscape spread in every direction, and the sound of the herd's passage through it was a music that had no composer and no audience and no purpose beyond the communication of identity and location and the simple, persistent fact of being alive. It was enough. In the Cretaceous, being alive and announcing it was always enough. The announcement sometimes required demonstration. The Dilophosaurus pair that shared a territory in the dense fern valley had developed a ceremony of mutual recognition that they performed each morning with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. The neck frills deployed simultaneously, the two creatures facing each other in a display that was both competitive and communicative, that said I am this and you are that and we are both here and we know it. The vibrant red and orange of the frills in the early morning light, the fine membrane texture translucent at the edges where the low sun came through, the two pairs of eyes reading each other across the space between them. It was a conversation in a language that had no words and needed none, because the information it conveyed was not abstract and required no translation. The cool cave shadow behind them, the warm jungle light in front, the dramatic composition of two mirror image displays. It was the language of presence, spoken fluently by animals that had been inventing it for as long as they had existed. Existence, in its most elaborate forms, required both the individual and the collective, and the ancient world understood this in ways that the creatures living it could not articulate but could only demonstrate. The Triceratops herd that emerged from the Cretaceous forest onto the open plain did so as a single coordinated entity, the adults in front, the subadults to the sides, the juveniles tucked into the interior spaces where the protective geometry of the group kept them safest. They moved at a pace set by the smallest legs among them, which meant they moved slowly, which meant the plain they crossed had time to be fully experienced. The midday heat rising from the prehistoric grass in visible waves, the sky above immense and pale and cloudless for once. In the distance, barely visible in the heat haze, the ridge where the T-Rex had stood that morning was empty now, and the plain was theirs, and they moved across it with the unhurried authority of animals that owned the world they walked through not by virtue of any transaction but simply by the fact of their presence in it. Presence in the water had a different quality entirely. The Mosasaurus cruising just below the clear Cretaceous surface was invisible from the water itself, its enormous form hidden in the refraction and the slight turbidity of the warm tropical sea, but from the coastal cliff above, from the aerial perspective that showed the full scale of the creature in the transparent shallow water, it was entirely, disconcertingly present. The warm tropical overhead sun came straight down through the clear water and lit the creature from above with a completeness that nothing in the depths could match, and its full outline was visible in the blue-green clarity, the massive body tapering to the powerful tail, the four large paddle-like limbs held against the flanks as it cruised, the enormous head, longer than a small boat, held level with the bottom of the water column. The aerial perspective that revealed all of this also revealed the scale relative to the shoreline features, the rocks and sandy shallows that established the size of ordinary things, against which the Mosasaurus was not ordinary at all but was instead something that the concept of size had been developed, in retrospect, to describe. The sea that contained such things was a sea that demanded respect, and the animals that crossed it or lived beside it or hunted from it developed a relationship with the water that was both intimate and carefully bounded. The pteranodon that banked above the coastal cliff had learned these boundaries through instinct and through the experience of watching the surface of the sea, through reading its colors and its movements for the information they contained about what moved below. The membrane stress wrinkles as it turned showed a body operating at the technical limits of its engineering, each maneuver a negotiation between intention and the physical laws that governed flight, and the creature navigated these negotiations with the fluency of something that had no memory of learning them because they had been learned before it was born, encoded in the geometry of its bones and the distribution of its mass and the fine, responsive tension of the wing membrane. The tension of the wing found its analog in the tension of the hunt, and the hunt was always somewhere in the Cretaceous. The velociraptor on the hilltop overlooking the Protoceratops pair moved with the calculating patience that was its evolutionary inheritance, its small body low against the rock, its yellow eyes tracking the two animals below with the unblinking attention of a mind that was doing something very specific and very focused. The pair below were engaged in the rituals of reproduction, absorbed in each other, their usual vigilance reduced by the imperatives of the moment to a dangerous minimum, and the raptor above was reading this reduction with the precision of a creature that survived by understanding the relationship between other creatures' attention and its own opportunity. The Cretaceous desert sunset behind the watching predator turned its outline to gold and its shadow long across the pale stone, and the cool tactical observation scene had a quality of intellectual engagement that was not comfortable to acknowledge but was entirely accurate. Accuracy in the ancient world was survival. Inaccuracy was the fossil record. The Shantungosaurus herd at sunset was pure silhouette, the enormous hadrosaurs visible against the vivid orange and purple sky as a row of shapes so large they seemed geological, the crests of the adults catching the last warm light of the day and throwing it back in brief, brilliant flashes before the sun went below the horizon and the colors of the sky began their long, slow fade toward the blue-gray of dusk. The wide Cretaceous Asian landscape spread below the sunset in tones of amber and ochre, the ferns and cycad trees already in shadow, the far mountains a dark line against the luminous sky, and the herd moved through this light with the unhurried pace of animals that had been making this particular journey at this particular time of day for reasons that they did not need to understand because the understanding had been built into their bodies long before they were born. Being born had its complications. The Argentinosaurus footstep that shook the pond had been placed by an animal that was still young, not juvenile, but young by the standards of the largest land animal that had ever existed, which meant still growing into a body that would not reach its full dimensions for decades. The ripples that spread outward from the impact in the pond were visible from directly above as a perfect, expanding series of concentric rings, each one slightly lower in amplitude than the last, the mathematical elegance of the pattern a contrast to the raw physical fact of what had caused it. The tiny shore details, the moss at the water's edge, the small ferns, the beetles moving through the mud, established the scale of the footstep, and the scale of the footstep established the scale of what had made it, and what had made it was already, at its current age, the size of a building. By the time it reached its full dimensions, it would be the size of something that did not have a ready comparison in the world of ordinary experience. Ordinary experience was not something the Cretaceous offered in large quantities. Every ordinary moment contained, within it, the possibility of the extraordinary. Every peaceful meadow had its predator at the treeline. Every calm river had its ambush point. Every dawn had the creature that had survived the night and was now facing the day with whatever resources the night had left it. The juvenile T-Rex that hid behind a Cretaceous rock as a Triceratops herd passed by was a creature in the middle of its education, and the education was composed entirely of these moments. The recognition of what you could not yet do, the patience of the not yet, the long apprenticeship to your own future capability. It was already large enough that the Triceratops calves at the edge of the herd would have been manageable prey, but the adults would not have been manageable, not yet, and the juvenile survival instinct had already performed the calculation and arrived at the correct conclusion and expressed it as this. Staying very still behind the rock while the herd passed, warm afternoon sidelight falling across the photorealistic young Tyrannosaurus in sharp detail, the passing herd a blur of hooves, and frill color and movement beyond. Movement resolved, eventually, into stillness, and stillness into the long perspective of the night. The night in the Cretaceous was not merely the absence of the day but a different world with different inhabitants and different rules, and the creatures that navigated it had developed their capacities accordingly. The Trudon was a creature of the dim and the marginal light, its large eyes gathering photons with an efficiency that made the shadows navigable, made the dark forest readable, turned the gray light of moon and stars into something workable. It moved through the Cretaceous forest in the hours between dusk and dawn with the quiet confidence of an animal that had turned the darkness from threat to advantage, and the insects it hunted, the small mammals it found, the eggs that were occasionally available, all of these were visible to it in light that would have been, to a creature with ordinary eyes, simply dark. The large eyes were the most immediately striking feature of the Trudon's face, and in the moonlight they caught the silver and threw it back with a slight, unintentional luminosity that made the animal's face, in the dark, a small, watchful lamp. Light, from whatever source, was always the beginning of the story. At the dawn of the following day, on the wide floodplain where the Cretaceous sky met the land in a long, flat line at every horizon, the Spinosaurus was still walking. It had been walking since before first light, the enormous sail catching the pre-dawn gray and holding it, the creature's navigation of the landscape purposeful but unhurried. Not the pursuit pace of an active hunt but the transit pace of an animal moving between hunting grounds, covering distance with the efficient, ground-eating stride that large bipedal predators achieve through the sheer length of their legs. The sail was the first thing the morning light found. The highest point of the animal turned pink and then amber as the sky brightened, and the creature grew larger in the frame as it continued toward the camera. That slow, expanding presence, the enormity increasing with each stride, the suspense of the approach, not the sharp, adrenaline suspense of the immediate threat but the slower, more philosophical suspense of something that is certain and enormous and approaching at its own pace, without particular concern for your reaction to its approach. The vast Cretaceous floodplain absorbed the creature's footfalls and the footfalls receded into the ambient sound of the world, and the Spinosaurus kept walking. It walked until the floodplain met the forest, and the forest opened to receive it, and the trees rose around it with their usual indifference to anything that was not themselves. The forest had its own vast, patient concerns. The trees that had been alive for a century were young trees. The trees that had been alive for 5 centuries were middle-aged. The trees that cast their shade over the grazing stegosaurus of the early Jurassic had watched, from their slow vegetable perspective, the entire history of the sauropods, had been saplings when the first small dinosaurs walked beneath them, had been mature trees when the first brachiosaurus stretched toward their crowns, had been ancient when the last of them moved through the world. The stegosaurus below them was eating the descendants of plants that had been young when the trees were young, and the world was a continuous thing despite its constant apparent novelty. The kentrosaurus in the late afternoon thicket was engaged with the immediate and had no interest in the continuous. It was facing a problem with a specific spatial structure, the predators at specific positions relative to its defensive capabilities, the spikes requiring to be pointed at specific threats, the physics of the tail sweep requiring a certain amount of clearance that the dense thicket was not generously providing. The dappled forest light fell across the scene in its fragmentary, jeweled way, and the kentrosaurus was moving through the problem with the methodical patience of an animal that had done this before and knew that patience, in the end, was the one quality that its adversaries' hunger would not permit them to match. Hunger had its own mathematics, and the mathematics were not always simple. The Deinonychus pack in the driving rain was hungry, and hunger was the engine of the chase, but the chase was also the teacher, and the teacher was also the test, and the test was also the result, each element folding into the others in the way that survival always did. Not as a series of discrete steps but as a continuous, overlapping, simultaneous process that the animals at the center of it experienced as pure present, pure motion, pure wet and cold and fast. The rain fell harder. The forest darkened. The lead raptor's yellow eyes were the only fixed point in the motion. Fixed points were rare and therefore precious. The Pachycephalosaurus head-to-head on the rocky hillside was a kind of fixed point, two bodies in complete and violent contact, both at rest in their collision. The amber and ochre landscape stopped around them for the duration of the impact. Then they separated and the motion returned, and the landscape began to move again as the two animals drew back and circled and prepared for the next collision with the patience of animals that had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. This was their morning. This was their entire day. The ancient trees on the hilltop shed no judgment along with their leaves. Judgment was not a Cretaceous concept. What passed for judgment in the ancient world was consequence. The direct, unmediated relationship between action and outcome that required no interpreter and offered no appeals process. The ankylosaurus that had swung its clubtail had not judged the allosaurus. It had applied the relevant force and observed the result, and the result was the allosaurus's problem to navigate as best it could. The triceratops that had charged through the river had not judged the river. It had entered the water and moved through it and emerged on the far bank and kept moving, because the far bank was where the food was and the food was the point. The point, viewed from sufficient altitude, was a landscape of points, a Cretaceous ecosystem visible in full panorama at the golden hour, the warm light of late afternoon falling across the whole complex tapestry of the ancient world in one sustained, generous illumination. The sauropods in the river, those long necks above the water's surface. The pterosaurs circling in the thermals above the canopy, their enormous wingspans tilting and banking in the invisible architecture of the warm air. The hadrosaurs in the meadow, moving in that characteristic undulation through the late afternoon ferns. The T-Rex on the ridge, standing against the burning sky, reading the world below with those amber eyes that missed nothing. And between all of these, in the rivers and the clearings and the dark spaces between the trees, the 10,000 other dramas that the wide view could suggest but not fully contain. The courting pairs and the territorial disputes and the migrations and the hunts and the feedings and the sleepings and the births and the deaths, all of it happening simultaneously, all of it part of the one enormous, complex, terrible, beautiful fact of the Cretaceous world in full operation. The T-Rex on the ridge stood still for a long time, reading the wind. Its nostrils processed the air in layers, the immediate, the near, the distant, and from the distant layer came something that made the amber eyes narrow fractionally, the massive head turn a degree or two, the body redistribute its weight in the subtle postural shift that preceded action without yet being action. Below the ridge, far below, the meadow was full of hadrosaurs that did not yet know they were being assessed, that were still engaged in the business of grazing with the complete absorption of animals that had not yet received the information that would change their afternoon. The T-Rex read the wind a moment longer, processing, calculating, and then it began to move, and the ridge shook slightly with its movement, and the hadrosaurs below did not hear the shaking from that distance, but somewhere in the back of their nervous systems something that had no name began to pay attention. The world paid attention through its bodies. Every creature in the Cretaceous was an instrument of attention, tuned to specific frequencies by specific evolutionary pressures, reading specific information from the specific texture of its specific world, contributing its specific attention to the vast, collective, uncoordinated act of perception that was the ancient world being aware of itself. The Trudent's large eyes, the Parasaurolophus's acoustic crest, the Spinosaurus's elongated snout, the T-Rex's acute olfaction, the Pteranodon's sensitivity to air pressure, each was a different window onto the same world, each revealing aspects invisible to the others, each incomplete and each necessary. Necessary things persisted. The Mammacosaurus's neck had been necessary for 50 million years, and it persisted because it worked, because the leaves at the top of the tall trees were worth the metabolic cost of the structure required to reach them, because the mathematics of the trade worked out in the creature's favor every time. The Ankylosaurus's armor persisted for the same reason. The Velociraptor's intelligence persisted. The Triceratops's horns persisted. The world was full of solutions to problems that the world itself had set, and the solutions were beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful, not ornamentally, not decoratively, but with the deep structural beauty of things that work. Working, in the afternoon heat of the Cretaceous floodplain, meant finding shade. The iguanodon herd that had crossed the misty lake in the morning were resting now in the long shadow of a cliff face that projected from the jungle's edge. Their large bodies relaxed into postures of temporary trust, their eyes half closed, their breathing slow and audible. The cliff face behind them was dark red sandstone, layered and striated by ancient deposition, and the shadow it cast was sharp and cool and moved slowly across the floodplain as the afternoon progressed, and the iguanodons moved with it, tracking the shade with the small, regular adjustments of animals that had learned to take comfort where it was available without over-investing in any single source of it. The pastoral scene had the quality of all rest scenes. It spoke of the interval between efforts, the necessary pause that made the next effort possible, the acknowledgement that even the Cretaceous world required its creatures to stop sometimes and simply be, without predation or migration or territorial display, simply present in the warm afternoon with the shadow moving slowly across the red sandstone and the sound of insects in the distant ferns. The insects had been there since before the first dinosaur and would be there long after the last, and their sound was the sound of the world at its most fundamental, the quiet baseline beneath all the larger dramas, the continuous low note of life at its smallest and most persistent scale. The beetles and the dragonflies and the ancient moths moved through the Cretaceous air with their own urgent businesses, their own predations and evasions, their own migrations and territories, and the dinosaurs moved among them largely unaware of their existence except when, occasionally, as with the juvenile velociraptors and their beetle, the two scales of life intersected and found each other briefly interesting. Interest was a form of intelligence, and intelligence took many forms in the Cretaceous. The Carnotaurus was not conventionally intelligent, not in the way that the Trudon was intelligent, not in the way that the Velociraptor was intelligent, but it had a different kind of intelligence, the intelligence of the athlete, of the pursuit specialist, of the creature that had invested everything in a single capability and had made that capability extraordinary. It moved through the Cretaceous with the coiled, ready energy of something that was perpetually on the verge of going very fast, its distinctive horned face scanning the middle distance with the focused attention of a runner preparing for a start, its legs distributing energy through the precisely tuned biomechanics of a bipedal sprinter. Even at rest, if the Carnotaurus could truly be said to be at rest, which was uncertain, it had the quality of compressed speed, of potential velocity waiting for the necessary information to release it. The release, when it came, was something to see. The Gallimimus that had been feeding in the open plain learned what compressed speed looked like when it decompressed, and the lesson was brief but comprehensive, and the plain that had been peaceful a moment before was suddenly a landscape of motion and urgency and the percussion of many feet, and then, after a while, only the wind moving through the prehistoric grass and the slow settling of the dust cloud. Dust settled. Rivers ran. The world continued. In the delta where the Carnotaurus had swum at twilight, the water was dark and warm and full of information, chemical gradients and thermal layers and the subtle pressure waves produced by everything that moved in or near it, all of it readable to the right instruments. The Suchomimus was moving upstream from the estuary toward the wider reaches of the river where the fish ran in schools dense enough that patience alone was sufficient strategy, and it moved with the unhurried, undulating gait of a creature that was comfortable in the water in a way that most large predators were not. Its long crocodilian snout held low near the surface, sampling the water chemistry as it went, reading the river's ongoing report of everything that had passed through it in the past several hours. The midday sun was behind it now, casting its shadow long ahead of it, and the rippling water reflections moved up the sides of its body in shifting patterns of light and dark that turned the creature, from certain angles and in certain lights, into something almost beautiful. Almost was often the best the Cretaceous offered. Almost safe, almost certain, almost peaceful. The qualifications were not failings but features, the necessary uncertainty that kept every creature's attention sharp and every moment meaningful. If the world had been safe, the eyes would have had no reason to stay open. If certainty had been available, the mind would have had no reason to keep calculating. The almost was the engine of everything. The engine ran on different fuels in different creatures and different seasons, but it always ran. The Dilophosaurus pair in their fern valley ran it on territorial certainty and reproductive opportunity. The Pachycephalosaurus on the rocky hillside ran it on competition and social hierarchy. The Brachiosaurus at the top of the Jurassic sequoia ran it on the simple, enormous fact of hunger and the extraordinary solution it had developed to address hunger. The T-Rex ran it on the combination of all of these and something harder to name, a quality of sovereign attention, of complete inhabitation of its role in the world, that the other predators possessed in pieces but that the T-Rex possessed whole. The wholeness was visible in the moments between activity, in the pauses. The T-Rex at the edge of the ancient redwood forest, dwarfed for once by the trees around it, stood in the cathedral light with a stillness that was not the stillness of rest but the stillness of complete attention. The body fully present and fully ready, the mind, if mind was the right word for the process, moving through its continuous assessment of the environment with the same unhurried thoroughness that the Spinosaurus applied to reading the river. The soft, diffused light that fell through the enormous trunks turned the clearing into a space out of time, a pocket of green stillness in which the scale of the predator was, for once, the smaller scale, and the trees were the largest fact, and the world demonstrated once again its capacity to contain multitudes. The multitudes gathered and dispersed and gathered again according to rhythms that were older than the creatures that embodied them, the migration rhythms, the seasonal rhythms, the daily rhythms of feeding and rest, the annual rhythms of breeding and nesting, the generational rhythms of birth and growth and death that turned individuals into species and species into lineages and lineages into the long, deep story of life on Earth. The Parasaurolophus herd that crossed the mountain pass was doing what its kind had done for generations before it and would do for generations after, navigating the same pass in the same season, calling to each other in the same register, following the same route through the same landscape. Not because they had been told to but because the route was encoded in them, was part of what they were, was as much an anatomical feature as the crest or the four-chambered heart. The heart, beating in the great chest of the Argentinosaurus, was large enough to generate a pulse that you could feel in the ground 10 meters away, a rhythmic seismic event, a biological drumbeat that the Earth absorbed and transmitted in diminishing waves until it was indistinguishable from the ambient geological noise of the planet. The creature walked through its valley with the epic-making pace of something that was not so much moving through the world as rearranging it slightly with each step, and the ferns that bent beneath its feet and sprang back after were the world's fastest record of its passage. The passage left traces. Everything left traces. The velociraptor eggs in the mossy nest were the most intimate kind of trace. The forward-looking traces, the traces of the future, the investment of everything into a small, warm, potential thing that would either hatch and grow and leave its own traces or would not, and in either case the making of the investment was the point, was the argument that the world was worth perpetuating, was the deepest commitment available to a creature that could not speak. The commitment required defense. The Deinonychus and the Trudon hunting together in the afternoon light were defending their commitment by meeting it, by ensuring that the calories required to sustain their bodies, to keep the engine of their existence running, would be available. The large iguanodon ahead of them was moving faster now, the nervousness that had been building for an hour condensing into something more urgent, the fern fronds falling back from its flanks as it pushed through the undergrowth with increasing speed. The two predators adjusted their positions with the smooth, unhurried precision of animals that had factored the iguanodon's acceleration into their calculation from the beginning, that had anticipated this moment and prepared for it, and the Cretaceous forest received the sound of the final moments of the pursuit, the crashing vegetation, the predator's rapid footfalls, the iguanodon's alarm calls, and then received the silence after, and held both with equal equanimity. The equanimity of the ancient world was its most awe-inspiring quality. Not the violence, not the scale, not the variety of its extraordinary inhabitants, but the equanimity, the way it continued to be what it was regardless of what happened within it, the way the river kept running after the struggle in it, the way the jungle closed back over every cleared space, the way the sky remained itself after every storm. The world was not indifferent to its inhabitants. It was made of them, was constituted by them, would not be itself without them. But it did not make exceptions for them, did not adjust its operations in favor of the sympathetic or the beautiful or the mighty. It held everything with the same completeness, the same flat, total, impersonal attention, and in doing so it gave everything the same dignity, the beetle and the Argentinosaurus, the hatchling velociraptor and the ancient T-Rex, the dragonfly above the river and the mosasaurus below the surface of the sea. The sea, at the end of the day, was the first and last of everything. It had existed before the dinosaurs and would exist after them. Its salt was in their blood, and its rhythms were in their breathing, and its eventual rise and fall and chemical transformation would be part of the mechanism by which their world ended and another began. The pteranodon that flew above it knew none of this. It flew because flying was what it did, because the air was what it was made for, because the thermal was there and the wing was built and the moment required nothing more than the tilting of the crest and the adjusting of the membrane and the patient, glorious, effortless exploitation of the physics that made flight possible in a world where flight had never been guaranteed but had, through the long labor of evolution, been achieved. The achievement was everywhere, in everything. The Cretaceous world was the record of 1 billion achievements, the achievement of the immune system, the achievement of thermoregulation, the achievement of binocular vision, the achievement of pack intelligence, the achievement of the egg, the achievement of the shell, the achievement of the frill and the crest and the sail and the armor and the horn and the claw and the tooth and the extraordinary improbable length of the neck. Each achievement was a solution to a problem, and each solution created new problems, and those new problems generated new solutions, and the whole process was not a march toward anything but a conversation with itself, endlessly recursive, endlessly surprising, endlessly productive of new forms and new strategies and new ways of being alive in the world. The world received them all. The mist in the morning clearing received the roar of the Tyrannosaurus. The calm lake received the reflection of the iguanodon. The volcanic highland received the footfalls of the Giganotosaurus. The chalk cliff received the bones of the pteranodon. The deep Cretaceous river received the waiting Spinosaurus and gave back moonlight. The rocky hillside received the collision of the Pachycephalosaurus and gave back dust. The fern meadow received the grazing Stegosaurus and gave back amber light along the dorsal plates. The ancient world received everything that lived and died within it and turned it, slowly, into the record that would outlast the living by inconceivable magnitudes, that would become the stone and the fossil and the layer of iridium at the boundary, and eventually the evidence that would allow creatures not yet imagined to reconstruct, imperfectly and incompletely but with genuine wonder, the world that had been here before them. The wonder was justified. The world had been extraordinary. It remained so until the end, and the end came not as the world's failure but as the world's completion, the full expression of the epic, the closing of the chapter, the last page of the long first volume of life's ambition on this planet. The creatures that moved through its last days moved through them as they had always moved, with urgency and with patience, with violence and with gentleness, with the specific gravity of living things that were completely embedded in their moment and had no knowledge of the enormity of what their moment was. The triceratops in the wildflower meadow grazed among the prehistoric blooms in the warm afternoon light, and the flowers were vivid around it, and the sky was clear and blue above, and the ferns at the meadow's edge were green and still, and the world was entirely itself, entirely present, entirely alive, and this was enough. This was, in fact, everything, and the afternoon held it all in the long, warm, amber attention of a sun that was not yet done with this particular day, that was still, hours from the horizon, still pouring its light across the ancient world with the same extravagant generosity it had been demonstrating for 4.5 billion years, unasked and unrequited and absolute. The T-Rex on the ridge above the meadow turned its amber eyes toward the sun and held them there for a moment that had no purpose. No hunting purpose, no territorial purpose, no purpose at all except the moment itself, the warmth on the scales, the light in the eyes, the world being the world being the world. Then it looked away and looked at the meadow below, and at the hadrosaurs in the middle distance and the sauropods at the river and the pterosaurs in the sky and the vast green Cretaceous world extending in every direction to the furthest horizon it could see, and beyond that horizon to horizons it would never reach, and beyond those to the edges of a world so large and so alive that no single creature could hold it all in mind at once, could only hold this ridge, this meadow, this amber light, this moment, which was the whole world, and was enough, and was everything, and was the ancient world being exactly what it was. Alive and loud and beautiful and urgent and temporary and complete. The mist gathered again in the clearing below. The light changed. A fern released its spores into the warm air, and the spores drifted upward on a thermal, and the thermal was the same thermal that had lifted the Quetzalcoatlus that morning, and the Quetzalcoatlus was still up there somewhere, still circling, still reading the air with its crest and its wings and its ancient eyes, still sovereign over the vast sky that was the roof of the only world it had ever known. The world breathed in, the world breathed out, and somewhere in the dark at the edge of the forest, in the warm hollow beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the valley, the egg moved again. If you got something out of this, leave a comment. I'd love to know what hit you hardest. And if you think someone else needs to hear this story, send it their way. Don't forget to subscribe and sound notifications for the next video. I'll have something new up soon. Until then, take care of yourself.